You are now tuned into the truth frequency.
We are TFR. TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Welcome, friends. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Secrets Revealed, and I'm honored to have as guests with me for the next 2 hours Timothy Alberino of Genesis 6 Productions. Timothy, are you there, brother?
I am, Zen. Delighted to be with you.
Oh, it's a great privilege. Thank you for making yourself open and willing, and looking forward to the discussion over the next 2 hours. But I did want to, and the reason why I read that particular passage is because of the premise of the Unholy Sea, the second in the documentary series that you and Steve Quell and others have been working on. And as I said in response to you when you sent me the link to it, I could only wish that the whole world would be able to watch this in the movie theaters, and what kind of a mind shift it would transform and cause in the public consciousness if people would just, actually go out there and watch it. It's a fantastic documentary, and it shows that there was a previous antediluvian age that was ruled over by these fallen ones, and that they were composing and constructing in megalithic fashion, which still remains unexplainable according to science as of today. And so if you would, can you speak about the documentary, where people can go to find it, and also how they can support you and your work and your various YouTube channels and etc.?
The film, The Unholy Sea, is the second episode, the second installment in our True Legends documentary film series. People can find the links to the various modes of our film on TrueLegendsTheSeries.com. They can buy the DVD, they can buy the Blu-ray, and also we offer unlimited streaming via Vimeo. So, and thank you for those kind words about the film. I think that there is a lot of misconceptions out there concerning what I refer to as the prehistoric past, meaning the antediluvian world. And I do believe that our film has helped to shed, at least to shed a little bit more light on the dynamics that were involved.
Absolutely. And I know a lot of people, they deny and they believe that the entirety of the Genesis timeline, that it only comprises the last 6,000 years of modern history. But as I show, and as we quoted from Peter, it's clear that he speaks of a world that was then and is different than what is currently as far as the generations of the heaven and the earth. And so in my mind, also, when you look up in detail the Strong's Concordance, the references with Genesis 1:2, where it speaks the earth having become without form and void, that the Most High created the earth, as it says in Isaiah, to be inhabited, and also he created it perfect. And yet something led to it having become a deserted wasteland and an indistinguishable ruin, as it references in the Strong's Concordant definitions of those words, tohu wa vohu. And so it seems clear to me that there was this previous age, and that judgment was brought upon the fallen ones, and that they were here even before we were, as is most certainly elaborated on in detail in the premise, and also all the travel that you did in showing the Cyclopean megaliths from Malta and other places. So if you would, can you speak about your travels? And I know that had just to be an incredible experience for you in going to those sites and being witness directly in their presence.
Well, we wanted to visit some of the most monumental sites where megaliths can be found, at least in the places that are safe to travel in at this point in time. A lot of the most amazing places, such as Baalbek and Lebanon, are at this point too close to the activity of ISIS to go to. But we went to South America. We went to the island of Malta. We went to the island of Sardinia. We went to Rome, to the Vatican, and we explored some of the most dynamic megaliths in those regions, and we found that there is a very distinct correlation between all of the megaliths. You mentioned the term Cyclopean, the Cyclopean masonry, which is a word that comes to us from the Greeks, from the ancient Greeks, who actually credited the Cyclops, the mythical Cyclops giant, with the construction of what they referred to as Cyclopean edifices, which are edifices constructed with stones without the use of mortar, very large stones in most cases. So we wanted to go to get an up close perspective on what we believe are the ruins of the world before the flood of Noah, because the world before the flood of Noah is so misunderstood. As I said earlier, there are a lot of misconceptions concerning that time in the biblical context, in the sense that a lot of people, and myself included, have been inculcated with the notion that the world before the flood of Noah was a time of simpletons on the earth, was a time where basically it just looked like a primitive world in which men were beginning to do bad things that made God angry, and so angry, in fact, that he sent a deluge and destroyed all life on the planet. When in fact, the reality, the intricacies of what was taking place during that epoch of time are almost inconceivable, and are absolutely not only relevant, but are the key to unlocking. It provides us with the keys to unlocking much of the prophetic context of the Bible concerning what is coming in the future. So we knew that we had to not just talk about giants, not just talk about fallen angels, but go and document the only evidence that remains on the earth that we can actually have access to, that we can get to from the pre-flood world, and that is the Cyclopean edifices, the ruins of the Cyclopean edifices. As much as archaeologists, conventional archaeologists and scientists would like to, and historians would like to negate the flood of Noah, there's absolutely overwhelming evidence. There's a, pun intended, a deluge of evidence concerning the flood of Noah. I mean, it happened, and it didn't just happen in a local, regional sense. It happened on a global scale. Because if you go to Puno, if you go to the Altiplano of Peru and Bolivia, near the city of Puno, and you look at the ruins of Pumapunku in Bolivia, you find that the ruins are showing evidences that they were submerged in water. In fact, that they were torn to pieces, ripped apart, disheveled by a flood, by very violent activity of water. And it wasn't a local flood; it was a global flood. Because if you go to the other side of the earth and you go to Malta, you find the same evidence. Everything was at one time submerged beneath the waves of the ocean. If you go to the island of Sardinia, which is still in the Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean, you find the exact same evidence. In fact, all over the earth. If you go to Baalbek, or even if you go to the far reaches of Siberia, you're going to find seashells. You're going to find the residue of creatures from the sea the crustaceans and so forth that have been preserved in the form of fossils, even on top of mountains. I mean, the flood, the flood of Noah, is a fact. It was recorded in this event. This great flood was recorded in the annals of many different high civilizations, ancient high civilizations on the earth, and in fact, in almost every ancient high civilization, primary civilization on the earth, along with the narrative of very powerful beings that descended from the heavens and their offspring that happened to be giants in almost every case, a variety of different kinds of hybrid giants, but giants nonetheless in every case. So, in almost every case, I should say. So the theme is persistent. It's prevalent across the globe. And so you start with the reality that the flood existed. Okay, as Bible-believing Christians, we can accept quite easily, in fact, it doesn't take much faith to accept the fact that the flood occurred. Then you have to ask the important question. The important question is, why did the flood occur? Is God so fickle that naughty behavior, let's put it in very nice terms, can result in the annihilation of not only almost total annihilation of not only the human species but every other kind of living thing on the earth? We know that it is much more than just your run-of-the-mill bad behavior. We know that there was something very unique happening in the pre-flood world that caused God to reset, to reinitiate life on the planet. And in fact, it was not only an act of judgment, it was an act of logic on God's part that he would reset the genomes of the creatures that he had created, that he had made, because there were unsanctioned creatures that had been created through miscegenation, through the illicit activity of the fallen watchers. And we're not just talking about for a month or a year or a few years. We're talking about over 1,000 years. Over 1,000 years of the history of this planet was a time when the angels were involved in miscegenation, which is the mixing of the genomes of different kinds of creatures, and which was strictly forbidden by God. Each kind was to reproduce after its kind. And so there was this monumental mess, this genetic chaos that ensued on the planet, in which all flesh, the Bible says, had corrupted its way on the earth. All flesh was corrupt. And if you take a look at the words that are involved in that language, you begin to realize that we're dealing with a genetic corruption, a corruption on the genomic level. And so there are many intricate pieces and parts to the pre-flood world that involve all kinds of sordid characters, not only the fallen angels, not only the watchers, as they're called in many of the ancient documents, extra-biblical documents, including the Bible and the book of Daniel. But you also have, which we discussed in a previous conversation, you also have the strange activity that was happening in the line of Cain without the advent of the watchers. I mean, even if the watchers had not descended to the earth, you still have to deal with this strange situation revolving around Cain and his descendants. Then you throw in the watchers on top of it, which I think you and I agreed last time we were talking, that Cain probably and his descendants probably had something to do with the descent of the watchers. And then you add in Enoch, who is called the scribe of righteousness, into the mix of all of this, and his dealings with not only the watchers and the giants, but also with the hosts of heaven that were still loyal to the Father and the Father himself. And you have what you have is an epic. You have a story, a legend, if you will, that happens to be true, that is far more interesting, fascinating than any other story that we could possibly concoct in with our own imagination. So it really is a fascinating topic. And what's really exciting, Zen, is that the evidence that this really happened, that what I just laid out is in fact, a scientific fact. The evidence is there. It still exists, not only in the form of the megaliths, but in some other ways as well.
Yes, that is the most amazing aspect of all of the mythology, and the way that it unites with the biblical narrative is that it most certainly is true. And the strange esoteric aspects of what the Bible speaks about with regard to the fallen angels, the fallen watchers, the Nakash, these dragon-like entities, and the presence of them, and the giants, the children born of the watchers, all of that, and the way that it all ties together with what we see in the archaeological, anthropological record, and the mythologies that most people thought were just childhood fantasy or fairy tale. It all is coming to light and is being affirmed with individuals like yourself, documentaries which you have been producing all over the world, the mythologies and the archaeological evidence, these megalithic, even ancient cities being found at the bottoms of the oceans at a time when humanity was supposedly less than hunter and gatherers and was not yet even declared to be on the scene as far as in modern form. And yet we have these ancient megalithic sites with huge temple complexes built all over the world in similar pyramidal fashion, and science has no explanation for it, which leads me to, I wanted to have you comment on the name of America and how it ties to the land of the feathered serpent, in which we see the ancient pagan religions worldwide, how they all revered the feathered serpent. And this all is, in my opinion, also connected to Genesis 3, the beguilement of Eve, and as you said, the strange nature of the line of Cain, which also ties together with the New World Order, the elites, the fascination, the worship of Lucifer as this also feathered serpent dragon-like entity.
The name America seems to have its roots, according, by the way, to Manly P. Hall, who was another occultist, but Manly P. Hall, who was one of the most renowned philosophers of the Masons of the Masonic Order, of the various Masonic orders, believe that the word America derives from the pre-Columbian natives of Central and South America. We know that both in Central America and South America, the term Amaru, especially in Peru, I know that for a fact because it's still this way today in the Quechua language. Amaru means serpent or dragon, and Ka, Ca, Amaru Ka, means the land. Ka means the land of. So you have Amaru Ka, meaning the land of the serpent or the land of the dragon, and specifically there's an indication that it's referencing the feathered serpent. So the term Amaru Ka, which was a term that the natives used, again, both in Central and South America, to describe the Americas, was in general to describe the Americas, was a word that meant land of the plumed serpent or land of the feathered serpent, or perhaps even just land of the serpent. We know also that the natives, the indigenous peoples of both South America, of Central America, and also the natives of North America, all had this very mystical perception of the serpent and the feathered serpent. And the serpent and serpentine entities play into their myths and legend quite often. So there is this very interesting connection between the cult mysteries of the the occult mysteries of the Inca and of the Maya and of the Aztec and of some of the North American natives concerning the serpent, concerning the serpentine beings that came and taught their people civilization. Well, this is a very interesting legend, because you find that this legend reoccurs, just like the flood, just like the offspring, the gods descending from heaven, their hybrid giant offspring. This is one of those legends that you can find reoccurrent all over the earth, and it involves these serpentine-like creatures. Some of the legends reference these creatures as being entities that a race of serpentine entities that abide in the inner earth, below the surface of the earth. Other legends talk about these entities coming through portals, showing up through what we might call stargates. Other legends talk about these entities coming from over the sea on boats or rafts, or descending from the heavens. So you have this feathered serpent creature showing up all over the place, especially in the Americas. And there seems to be a correlation. At least, again, Manly P. Hall believed that there was a correlation. The only reason I would reference Manly P. Hall is to demonstrate that the occult, the world of the mysteries, of the adepts of the mystery schools, in many cases, and I would say in most cases, have a better understanding of history than scientists, than the historians, than the archaeologists, because their history, their traditions, the traditions of the occultists go back further. They go back, in fact, all the way to the pre-flood time. So, but that is in no way an endorsement of the occult, because we have a better record, and it is the story, the narrative that is contained in the Bible is a truer, is a better record. In fact, the occult record is oftentimes a narrative that comes from the rebels. It is a narrative, a perspective that comes from the fallen angels and from the rebels, the enemies of God. And so they don't deny that the Bible is true. They just take an opposing view to the God of the Bible and to the truths that are deliberated therein. So, Amaruka, the land of the plumed serpent. It seems that the United States, which was destined to become the new Atlantis, was named after the land of the plumed serpent, or was named in accordance with what the Native Americans themselves called their land, which was the land of the serpent, or the land of the plumed serpent, Amaru Ka, and there are different variations of it. So obviously, if you Spaniardize the word Amaruka, or if you put it into a more in English phonetics, you can easily derive America from Amaruka. And of course, we learn in school that America was named after Amerigo Vespucci, and there are a number of reasons why that is probably not the case. But it's very interesting when you think about the destiny of America, when you think about what the mystery adepts believe about America, when you take a look at Francis Bacon and the Rosicrucians and the New Atlantis. There's a lot of indication that there are many out there who believe that America is in fact and always has been Amaruka, the land of the serpent, or the land of the plumed serpent, referencing specifically these beings. By the way, we're not just talking about regular snakes. The snake is symbolic of these entities, these serpentine creatures that are sentient, and you'll find that symbolism connected to these creatures all over the earth.
Yes, and it also seems to be linked to how here we have the eagle as representative of America, but that seems to be tied to an even ancient, more iconic symbology, and connected to also the two-headed eagle of the Roman Empire. And I have discovered that it is also connected to the phoenix, which the phoenix is said to have been one of these feathered basilisks. So in the same kind of thing, the dragon as a feathered serpent, a winged serpent, reptilian type of dragon-like entity. And so it seems even that iconography is all linked in similarity to what we are speaking about.
Yes, and it's important to understand when considering the United States, when considering the destiny of the United States or the occult destiny of the United States, that there's always been a dichotomy here in this land. A dichotomy that began long ago with the colonization scheme under Francis Bacon, because it was Francis Bacon who initiated and managed the colonization scheme. When the Pilgrims were coming over, who were Puritans, at the same time, shortly after they arrived, Francis Bacon began to sow into the United States the different secret societies.
All right, we'll be right back. We'll pick it up on the other side. All right, welcome back, everybody. Timothy, I want to give you a chance to finish up your thought, and then I'll bring up another. Are you there, brother?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I was talking about the dichotomy that exists in the United States, that has existed from the beginning, because when the United States began to be colonized, of course, William Bradford came over on the Mayflower with the Puritans. They were Bible-believing Christians. They rejected the Church of both Rome and the Church of England. They read the Geneva Bible, and they came over for religious freedom, to be able to worship God in the tradition of the apostles. But at the same exact time, or shortly thereafter, Francis Bacon, who was in charge of the colonization scheme in England at the time, began to very purposely send over to this land Rosicrucians, Masons, Kabbalists, mystics, to seed them into the birth of the colonies. So that dichotomy has always existed between the faction on the one hand that consists of Bible-believing Christians who are trying to live in accordance with the scriptures and the tradition of the apostles, and then on the other hand, you have posers, you have occultists who pose as Christians. I mean, the Rosicrucians, their symbol is the Rosy Cross, and what the Rosy Cross represents is the symbol is a cross with a rose superimposed on top of the cross, and what that represents is the mystery schools. Basically, it represents Christianity that is superimposed by the mysteries. It is a mixture of Christianity and the mysteries, the occult. And that is the dichotomy that's existed in this country. You've had true Bible-believing Christians since the beginning. Whom, the Puritans made a pact with God when they came over. They certainly endured many very difficult times in the early days of the colonies, and made a covenant with God here in America. And I believe that God honored their covenant and that God blessed their work. But then at the same time, you had the mystery schools that were at work, who were actively working to build a new Atlantis, a new occult empire, and ultimately enthrone the great philosopher king. So that's the dichotomy that's existed in the United States for a very long time. So when we talk about, since the beginning, so when we talk about the United States being Amaru Ka, land of the plumed serpent, it's not a fatalistic view. It's not, I don't hold the perspective, I don't hold the view that the United States is absolutely destined to bring about the rise of the Antichrist or something like that. I believe that the United States has been locked and will be locked for some time into the future, locked in a battle between the traditional Bible-believing faction and the occult faction. And at this point in time, unfortunately, the occult faction has definitely won over the culture. But But that's a whole different conversation, so I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole.
Yes, there's a question from the chat room. Well, first they said that also with what we're speaking, there's connection to the flying fiery serpent as well. And I'll bring something up that Solomon had said in connection to the strangeness of these particular beings. But they wanted to ask you if you saw this presence being also part of Nimrod and the Stargate, the Tower of Babel, and were they instructing them on that particular construction and what you thought about its purpose?
You mean the serpentine entities?
Yes.
Well, I'll be honest with you. It's a confusing. These entities this is a confusing situation, because we have three paradigms that are at work whenever we look behind us into the past, going all the way back to Adam and beyond. We have a pre-Adamic paradigm, which obviously would indicate the time before Adam, the time before the human race showed up on the scene. We have a pre-flood paradigm, which would indicate the time from Adam to the flood of Noah, and we have a post-flood paradigm, speaking of the time from when the waters of the flood receded to today, to this very moment. So when looking back, it's hard to place some of the different entities that we encounter in the Bible, that we encounter in some of the extra biblical texts, that we encounter in ufology, that we encounter in abduction scenarios, even today. It's very difficult to place some of these creatures. It is in some ways easy to place, for example, the giants. We know that the giants specifically had their origin in the advent of the Watchers, when the Watchers descended from heaven and copulated with human women and were involved in the miscegenation of life on the earth. That's where the giants came from. There's no doubt. That was their origin. Their primal origin was from the Watchers. They were more of the Watchers than they were of the human women, according to the Book of Enoch. Nonetheless, they were hybrids, and we know that many of their spirits still wander the earth today as unclean spirits. Those are the possessing spirits, the spirits that Jesus casted out with a word on numerous occasions in the New Testament. Okay, so we can file the giants away. We know where they come from. We know where their origin and where they have their origin. I think in that category we can also probably categorize the Cyclopes, the fawns and the satyrs and the centaurs and the minotaurs and those kinds of creatures that come to us from Greek mythology, not only Greek mythology, Mesopotamian mythology as well. We can probably take those creatures that are part of the Mesopotamian and Greek mythology and file them away also into the advent of the Watchers and the miscegenation. So that takes care, in my mind, of a large swath of mythical creatures. But even after you've done that, even after you settled that in your mind, you still have to deal with these serpentine entities, right? Yes. Where do they come from? And they seem to have their origins, from what I can tell. And this is I lean in this direction. Let's just put it that way. That these entities, these draconian creatures, whatever you want to call them, they're known by different names, seem to me to have their origin in the world before Adam, in the pre-Adamic paradigm. Yes. They might have been here before Adam. They might be the residue of a time before the human race. We encounter one of them in the garden, at least. Now, whether that was the devil himself, or that maybe perhaps the devil is of this kind of thing. Maybe he's the chief. Maybe he is their father. Maybe he seeded this particular kind of draconian race on the earth, and perhaps in other places as well. But one thing that I find very interesting about these entities is that many times, I would say, in many circumstances throughout the legends and myths of many cultures, you find these entities associated with the underworld, with the empire that exists under our feet, so to speak, the hollow earth, if you will. And certainly even in modern times, and anybody who's familiar with Nazi lore will be familiar with the Vril Society, will be familiar with the Vril Ya, the book by Edward Bulwer Lytton, called The Coming Race, which describes this race of draconian serpentine entities that live in the bowels of the earth. And it's called the coming race because the occult world prophesies a time in which they will emerge from the bowels of the earth to govern the earth, to basically to take over the kingdoms of men and to rule over the kingdoms of men. And of course we have the Nakash, I believe they're called the Naga race in India, this serpentine race of entities that lives beneath the ground. So I don't know exactly where they have their origins. Again, I suspect that their origins are that their origins are in the pre-Adamic paradigm, in the pre-Adamic world. However, these entities are also associated with, very heavily associated with abductions, flying saucers, and so forth. So we know, of course, those who are familiar with the DUMBs, the deep underground military bases, might be familiar with the story of Phil Schneider, who seemed to encounter something like these creatures under the ground, in the very deep reaches of the subterranean world. So we have this strange situation going on where there are these serpentine creatures that seem to be inhabiting the planet with us. And so to answer the question, is it possible that they have been interacting with the human race since the beginning? I think it is not only possible, I think it is probable that the human race has had interaction with these creatures. But I also believe that there may be, and we might have talked about this before, I don't remember, but there may be a correlation between the judgment of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, where he is consigned to crawl on his belly and eat dust, and the idea that these creatures are consigned to the bowels of the earth, essentially eating dust beneath our feet. And so we may be looking at a situation in which these entities are confined to the bowels of the earth. They're confined to the subterranean world. They're not permitted to operate on the surface of the earth, or maybe they can't anymore. Maybe their physiology was changed. Something was changed in their genomes that no longer allows them to exist on the surface of the earth as they once did. That might be part of the judgment that not only befell the serpent in the garden, but his kind, his race, perhaps, or his offspring. So I do believe that interaction with these entities does happen. Did it happen specifically at the Tower of Babel? Did it happen with Nimrod? I have no idea. I can tell you that the Sumerian myths talk about an individual named Uana Adapa, who was a sage from the pre-flood world, who is, the story goes that he came out of the sea after the great flood. We're in a post-flood context now. He comes out of the sea, which I find very interesting, emerges out of the sea, and begins to reteach humanity some of what was lost before the destruction of the world in the flood, in the pre-flood world. And so he was, by the way, depicted as a half-man, half-fish creature. But we know that that in many cases, in myth and legend, that the descriptions of these beings is their physical descriptions are designed to encode information, esoteric information. So when they say that this was a half-fish, half-man creature, it might not have been a half-fish, half-man creature, but that physical description is giving us encrypted information. In other words, this entity came teaching some of the lost knowledge from before the flood, when the world was covered in water. And remember that that only the life on the land was destroyed. I think it is very probable that much of the sea life remained during the flood. So, and by the way, in the book The Coming Race by Edward Bulwer Lytton, the Vril-Ya, this serpentine race that this guy encounters, it's a long story. He ends up under the earth in the subterranean world, and he encounters this race that call themselves the Vril-Ya, that are highly advanced creatures. They kind of look like tall gray aliens. If anyone out there is familiar with the ufology and the tall grays that people encounter in abduction scenarios, they kind of look like that, but they can fly and they communicate telepathically. Well, this race, this advanced race that lives in the bowels of the earth, they claim to be survivors from the world before the flood. So the question is, are there exiles from Atlantis, as they call them, the exiles of as I call them, the exiles of Atlantis? Are there survivors, hybrid survivors that came from the illicit activity, the miscegenation of the fallen angels? And I think that the answer is yes. And the reason why I believe the answer is yes is precisely because of Uwana Adapa, precisely because of the all of this mythology concerning these creatures that seem to have persisted on the earth, even going back as far as the time before Adam. And I apologize for the long-winded answer to that very good question.
No, that was we need that kind of elucidation. People are seeking to get that kind of guidance and direction, and so no, we appreciate you taking the time to go into detail on these kind of answers. And I fully agree with you on so many points that you brought up. And I'm actually working on a trilogy called The Great Contest, which begins with the war in heaven, because as I've discovered, Enoch in Second Enoch, in chapter 29 and 30, it pinpoints the day that the rebel angels are cast out of the heavens as being on the second day. And so the timeline that is being laid out, and it also speaks about as the beginning of the war in heaven and the iniquity that was found within Lucifer, all occurred when Yeshua was revealed as the light of the world and given dominion, command over the hierarchy of the heavenly hosts. And that's when he becoming jealous, where it says in scriptures where the light and the darkness were separated, that this is when the forces of these celestial hierarchies, the angels and the angelic hosts, that they were divided and this war occurred, and then they were cast out on the second day. And so it also affirms, as we are speaking about here, that the rebel angels were cast out and were present here upon the earth prior to the sixth day creation and fall temptation of Adam and Eve and the beguilement of Eve and her impregnation with Cain. And the next aspect of the great contest would be the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent as it plays out. But that most certainly from the time of the second day to the sixth, that they were busy here upon the earth creating these megalithic sites, and also involved with the pre-Adamic humans that were already here. And it speaks about them trying to, in the Anunnaki and the Sumerian mythology, it speaks about them trying to create and to manipulate that particular pre-Adamic human in the best way they could in order to create a slave labor force, a menial. But most certainly this being didn't have the abilities, the capacities that Adam and Eve and all that we could and have accomplished since then. But they did make a type of slave creature out of this pre-Adamic being, and then they also incorporated the teaching of these pagan abominations, the victim blood sacrifice, children sacrifice, the cannibalism, the drinking of blood, all of that was also incorporated into the religions and the reverence of the fallen angels that were taught to the pre-Adamic peoples worldwide. And this is why we see reflected in the ancient religions the worship of the feathered serpent, and they're incorporating cutting out the still beating hearts and things of that nature, which most certainly the Most High, Yahweh Elohim in the Old Testament, he put a prohibition against such behavior. And we see this contest, this war between the pagan fallen angels and that of Yahweh Elohim and his chosen people, and Christ, the continuance with the war with the Pharisees, and the ongoing war now, even today, with the most of humanity and the New World Order elites, as they try to subjugate and push us towards recreating those paganized and abominable acts of worship and reverence that they were involved in all throughout history. And so I do absolutely believe that you are correct in your very precise and elaborate description of all the different creatures and the many different incursions, and the fact that we've been at war not against flesh and blood, but these powers, these principalities, rulers of darkness and wickedness in high places. And so, comment?
Yeah, I think that when talking about the Garden of Eden and the beginning of the human race, I absolutely believe. I think it's very rational to believe in a pre-Adamic paradigm. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I think it's irrational not to believe in a pre-Adamic paradigm for a number of reasons. But I do also believe that Adam was the first man. I believe that the Bible is unequivocal when it, in that sense, that Adam, on that point, I should say, that Adam was in fact the first human being. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that there were other sentient creatures, sentient entities before Adam. You have, of course, the question. I think we probably talked about this before. The famous question: who did Cain marry, right, and who was he afraid of when right, he was banished from the family line, when he was banished from the clan, so to speak, of Adam? And this is a simple answer: is that he was afraid of Adam's sons, and that he married one of Adam's daughters. Well, he might have married one of Adam's daughters, okay, but I don't believe that he could have been afraid. He would have been afraid of Adam's sons, especially since he was banished mm-hmm, to a different land where Adam and his sons were not. They were not. They were simply he was sent away from the Adam's family, and so he was obviously afraid of something that he might encounter in the place he was being banished to. So that automatically raises a flag in my mind, and I have to ask the question: were there other sentient creatures on the earth that were inhabiting the world outside of the garden? And I think that the simplest answer is yes. So yes. Then we have to. Then if you unpack that idea further, then you have to ask the question: well, what became of those peoples, those creatures? I don't believe they were human. I believe they were something other than human. Human beings. See, we sometimes tend to ascribe sentience, consciousness to the human race. Certainly Darwinian science ascribes consciousness, sentience to the human race, and singularly to the human race, when in fact that is that's a fallacious, it's an erroneous perspective. We ought to understand, reading the Bible even at a very basic level, that conscious beings existed long before the human race was created. So this idea of consciousness, this idea of sentience. Let's take it further. The idea of civilization and language and tools and building and everything that is associated with civilization did not originate with us.
Right.
And it's kind of an arrogant position for us to assume that all things sentient started with us, and maybe started with God and then us, or maybe God and then some angels and then us. I think that there was civilization and technology and knowledge around long before the human race. And so we have to break ourselves out of that very restrictive humanistic paradigm in which we cannot imagine a world sans the human race without us in it, which is again, it's a very arrogant perspective that many people have without even realizing it. And it causes a lot of confusion, because when you take a look at anything seriously, whether it be history, whether it be archaeology, whether it be ufology, if you take a look at anything, whether it be the occult, you're going to quickly run into other sentients that are not us. And in a very real way, I mean, things that are building cities and, impressive Cyclopean walls and towers and so forth. And then you're going to find that their bones have existed and have been discovered and have been secreted away, by the way, which is very much a part of the content of our last film, The Unholy Sea, that we talked about in the beginning, in the beginning of this conversation. So it's all very interesting. And again, just we got to be careful of a humanistic perspective of the totality of history.
I fully agree. We'll be right back for second hour. All right, welcome back, everybody. There's a couple things that I wanted to ask you about, Timothy, and that's some of the because, of course, these megalithic sites and the way that they are aligned to various star constellations, that, in my opinion, also shows a high degree of intelligence. And being able to pull off aligning on the ground these megalithic sites with the various, like these solstices and the equinoxes, and also these different star constellations, that in my mind most certainly shows that the people that put these structures into place had a high degree of technology, capability, and knowledge of the heavens, which hunter and gatherers, pre-Adamite humans would not be able to have such knowledge, especially back then when, science claims that we were just only involved in at the very meager ends of starting to develop technological abilities and capacities. And so I wanted to ask you about the Grand Canyon alignment, and if you had seen just recently, somebody showed how there's structures in the Grand Canyon called even like Isis's temple, different Egyptian temple names, and they seem to align with the Belt of Orion. And the individuals that have made these discoveries are speculating as to whether there are indeed ancient temple sites in the Grand Canyon that are related to these particular alignments. Well,
we were actually in the Grand Canyon, near the Grand Canyon recently. We were actually in the desert Southwest in the Four Corners region with our Gen 6 Productions team, and we met Tom Horn and his team down there. We were filming for episode 3 of our True Legends series, which is in post-production. And we were actually talking about the fact that many of these monuments in Monument Valley and in the Valley of the Gods and the general southwestern area of the United States, especially the Four Corners region, how a lot of these monuments down there have Egyptian names and do seem to be aligned with the stars, with certain constellations. Certainly, even the Anasazi Indians, who Tom Horn has done a lot of investigation into the Anasazi Indians, and that's actually part of the third episode in our series. We're dealing with the Anasazi Indians, and Tom Horn is in the film. So even the Anasazi Indians had aligned their villages with the stars, with the heavens, and so being able to align your village or a certain kind of a construction, a temple, with the stars requires a very high degree of mathematical precision. And we're talking about a degree of mathematical precision that we were only able to accomplish really after creating computer systems. In fact, it took us creating computer systems to be able to discover the alignment of a lot of these different ancient locations. And you have two things happening. You have on a more superficial level, you have civilizations such as perhaps the Anasazi that are definitely obviously post-flood, that are discovering the remnants of older constructions which were already aligned with the heavens. And these latecomers would then build on top of these, in many cases, pre-flood constructions. So that's a dynamic that happens all over the earth. But when we talk about the actual the pre-flood constructions themselves, or the constructions that were built from the ground up, aligned with the stars, there's no question that would have required an intimate knowledge of the heavens. I mean, far beyond just cosmology, just having an understanding of the constellations. These people had to have a high degree of mathematical capabilities. I mean, and in fact, today there's a dating process, a method for dating, especially megaliths, that's becoming widespread and very popular, and that's gaining credibility very quickly. And it is a method that dates a location based on the configuration of the constellations for any given date in history. In other words, if you look back 7,000 years, let's say, for example, the walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, and you look through, there's different programs now that you can do this with, and they're very easy to use. And they give very accurate information. So if you look back in time, you can find the different periods of time that different constellations might have aligned precisely with a cluster of megalithic constructions in any given area. And this method is being used, and it's becoming apparent that many, if not most, megalithic constructions around the earth are directly aligned with certain constellations. And I mean precisely aligned with certain constellations. So it's the old occult adage, as above, so below. Right. There was a reason why the ancients did this. And it wasn't just symbolic. There was a very real connection that could be established between the earth and the heavens, a very real physical and as well as metaphysical connection, in which properties of the physical world could be altered or accessed. You might call them extra dimensions or what have you. But we're dealing with, actually, when we talk about metaphysics, when we talk about what people glibly call the spiritual world, what you're really dealing with is a very, very deep level of material science. Because when you go as deep as you possibly can into the scientific exploration of the material world, and you get to the subatomic level and beyond, the distinction, the difference between the physical and the metaphysical becomes obscure. Essentially, you transition directly from the material into the immaterial, from the physical into the spiritual, so to speak. Definitely from the physical into the metaphysical. So there's something. The alignment with the stars again was not simply because they worship the constellation of Orion. Therefore, they aligned the pyramids on the Giza plateau, directly beneath the belt of Orion. That's not why they did it. They did it for a very practical reason that had to do with extremely advanced scientific and metaphysical properties. In other words, they were getting something very practical out of the alignment.
Yes, and tapping into something that we still don't as yet fully understand, but it seems
Exactly.
like the occultists most certainly understand more than we do the science behind all that, thus CERN, and thus them building on top of already very ancient sites.
That's right.
Even like as you depict in the Unholy See, with the Vatican taking over some of these very ancient sites in South America, building on top of them, and then being able to clandestinely to investigate and to dig and do further introspection and also occult and ritualized practice with these particular areas and sites, and doing this all incognito in their churches and their underground labyrinths and catacombs and things of that nature.
That's precisely right.
Yeah,
In fact, let me say, Zen, that that narrative of the Catholic Church, the cover-up of the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church has absolutely taken control of very specific areas on the earth, having to do with megaliths, having to do with underground facilities and so forth, ancient underground facilities and occult power and so forth. It's unquestionable that the Church of Rome has done just that, has occupied those areas. In the episode 3, the one that's under production right now, the one that we're currently working on, we actually, and this is a probably not supposed to give this much information away yet, but here's a teaser for the next episode. We are in Sardinia, on the island of Sardinia, which is part of the province, which is a province of Italy, and it's off the western coast of Rome, and it's an island below Corsica, and on the island of Sardinia, we interviewed multiple individuals, who participated themselves, first-hand witnesses. They uncovered with their own hands, they dug up the bones of giants. Not only giants, in some cases we're dealing with cyclops beings, cyclops giants, and they dug them up with their own hands, but they didn't dig them up of their own because they were out looking for the bones of giants. They dug them up because they were hired by the municipality of Sardinia, specifically to dig those bones up, the bones of giants. And because they knew they were there. And where do you think the bones went? In every case, I'm talking every case that we have from Sardinia, or at least in almost every case, where they're unearthing the bones of giants. And when I say the bones of giants, we're not talking about NBA basketball players. We're talking about 9 to 15-foot giants. Where do you think the bones went? Immediately, literally from the ground to the interior of a church. That's exactly the procession. The bones came up out of the earth and went into the church, the nearest church. And the entire operation was overseen by priests. And the bones of giants literally would vanish the next day. I mean, they would unearth all of these bones, these skulls that are 3, 4 times, 5 times the size of ours, right? Carrying them between 2 people, very carefully, so as not to destroy them. They were very interested in preserving these bones, not just destroying them, mind you, preserving them, bringing them directly from the ground into the chapel, into the Catholic Church. The nearest Catholic Church, and very interestingly, in many cases, there's the Catholic Church already there. Boom, right there on the site. because of what we just said, that the many times Catholic Church, even little chapels, are often located right on top of the bones of giants or underground caverns or megalithic constructions and places of occult power. And so, I mean, in the first episode, we're kind of alluding to that. I mean, in the second, actually, in the first episode, we allude to it. In the second episode, we come out and tell you that the Vatican hasn't been involved in this cover-up, and we prove it with historic documents, actually, in the first episode. Then we go to the Vatican in the second episode. And then in the third episode, we're listening to Sardinian locals talking about unearthing these bones and carrying them into the church, where the priests are overseeing the entire operation. And of course, the bones are never seen again. So where do they go? I mean, where do they go? Obviously, they were preserving them. They're preserving them. They're very careful to preserve them. In fact, like when they would discover a skull, a giant skull, say 3 times the size of a skull belonging to a 15-foot tall giant or a 12-foot tall giant, they would the way that they were dealing with these skeletons was that they would have to pack earth into the parts of the skull that were cracked or broken, and they would have to sort of like fill in the gaps with clay, and then very carefully place the skulls and the bones onto whatever boards or whatever they were using to carry them. So they were very intentionally very interested in preserving the bones, preserving the skulls. And when I say they, I'm talking about the priests, because that was the end user, so to speak, of these remains of giants. And in many cases, we're dealing with hazmat-like situations, Men in Black type situations, where the remains of giants would be discovered by people who were just haphazardly digging in their vineyard or something, and they unearthed, all of these giants, many of them in some cases, and suddenly somebody would come and demand that everyone stops working and vacates the area, and shortly thereafter, professional individuals show up, but the authorities show up from the capital. Cagliari is the name of the capital in Sardinia. The authorities show up and shut everything down, right? And then everything's gone the next day. Everything has been exhumed and is now gone. So, so the question is, what in the world are they doing with these bones? And if they just wanted to hide them, they could simply dynamite them, right? Pile them, collect them. And in some cases, they did collect them in piles and burn them. We know from both the historical accounts and the more contemporary accounts in Sardinia. They did, in fact, and the reason why they did that was because there were so many of them. That's why they would burn them. There were just so many of them that they would just pile them up and burn them, and then they would take whatever was left and throw them to the back of a truck that would come, and it would take the remains away. But in many cases, these things were being preserved very carefully. And we're talking mummies too. We're not just talking skeletons. We're talking mummies. By the way, these giants are wearing necklaces and bracelets. These giants are wearing garments. These are not mastodons. These are not giant sloths. These are not dinosaurs. These are the remains of humanoid creatures that not only were wearing, in some cases, jewelry and had gold coins and so forth, but were also surrounded by artifacts that were of gigantic proportion. For example, large plates and forks and utensils that are 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the size of what we would use, obviously fashioned proportionally by their makers. And so it's very fascinating. It is very fascinating. And not only is there the question of the cover-up, the even more fascinating question in my mind is, what in the world are they doing with the remains of the giants? I mean, they're obviously not on display in a museum.
Right.
So there's in my mind, there's the search for the occult knowledge. They want the knowledge associated with all of this, and so they want the DNA. I'm sure they're looking for DNA. I'm sure they're trying to extract the different strands of DNA belonging to the different races, species, if you will, of giants and hybrid creatures. What are they doing with them? We can only guess. I mean, we could speculate all day long, but and I'm sure they're also incorporating the remains of these creatures into their occult ceremonies. I think that's a given.
Yes, absolutely.
And they're probably being trafficked. In fact, I can say quite confidently that they are being trafficked. And when I say they, I mean the remains of giants and of other creatures are being trafficked in a black market. Let's call it a deep black market that's deeper than the market in which human trafficking is taking place, or the trafficking of drugs. This is an even deeper market. This is an even darker market in which the bones and mummified bodies of giants and cyclopes and other hybrid entities are being bought and sold. By who? By whom is the question. And I asked that question in Sardinia, and the answer that I got from one of the individuals who dug a couple of skeletons up himself, 10 feet tall, his response was he believes he is of the persuasion that the Vatican and the Illuminati, the Masons and the Illuminati, are trafficking in these bones for occult purposes, in the remains of these giants and these other hybrid creatures. So it's very much an Indiana Jones type situation happening, but not the Ark of the Covenant, and not the Nazis, at least. Right. Not Nazis wearing swastikas, let's put it that way. And so instead of the Ark of the Covenant, picture skeletal remains of giants or cyclopes being trafficked and being sought after by agents from Rome, by perhaps intelligence agencies, by perhaps individuals who are involved in black budget projects dealing with super soldiers. I mean, it's happening, and it's really bizarre.
Yeah, I would say probably the full spectrum of, definitely the men in black are involved, and that even some of the wars. There's speculation that the focus on Afghanistan and Iraq with the recent wars and the expansion of the war of terror and on terrorism in the Middle East, that it's to gain access to some of these countries where they have these archaeological and megalithic sites, and that even when the invasion first occurred, immediately the museums, the places that have all of these archaeological discoveries and finds that in many times not even yet cataloged, all of that ended up disappearing. And there was many cry out to have these places protected, but I think that those that did give the green light to invade these areas, that they also wanted access, and so maybe in that way prevented them being protected in any way, and they went in and took what they wanted. And that certainly the elites are trading in not only these kind of archaeological, but even ancient texts, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were discovered, there was two entire Aramaic copies of the Book of Enoch, which were discovered and we don't have access to, but which were affirmed as being part of the discovery, and other aspects, and we get the fragments, and yet they get the full manuscripts. And so that kind of thing is also involved in going on. And then the whole Vatican archives and the many hundreds and thousands, who knows how many texts and ancient books over the full history of humanity, going back who knows how far, but that a lot of that material is also protected and kept and stored, and only for their eyes are privileged to access and study and look into some of that stuff. And but the public is kept in the dark, and so much even of what is discovered now, we are not privy to. I heard just recently there was a discovery of 70 metal books that date back to the time of Christ, and that have a lot of affirmation as to Christ being the fulfillment as far as the Savior, Messiah that the Jews were waiting for. And so there's a lot of stuff that is being hoarded, kept secret, and hidden from us. But I wanted to ask you about the encounters with living giants in this day and age, because you also covered this aspect of it, and this is quite an interesting story, and most certainly one that Steve Quell was in confident told about from different aspects, special forces, our military, high 5-star generals, or different individuals that have that kind of access to that kind of knowledge. Can you tell us of what you know of current encounters, and that these giants are still to this day and age in existence and part of the fabric of creation?
We feature a story in the beginning of our film, The Unholy Sea, episode 2 of the True Legends documentary film series, of a pilot, an AC-130 pilot, active duty AC-130 pilot, who we interviewed, who was called into Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan to pick up some high-value cargo, in other words, confidential cargo. And he and his lift master, the lift master is the personnel that is in charge of operating the lift gate on the AC-130 to load and unload the cargo, flew into Bagram Air Force Base. I believe it was 2005. And they were met on the tarmac by individuals who they referred to thereafter as the babysitters. And the reason why they called them the babysitters was because they were assigned to accompany the cargo to its final destination. And I hear the music coming, so I can continue this on the other side.
On the other side, yeah. We'll be right back, everyone, for final segment. All right, welcome back, everybody, for final segment. Timothy, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but if you would, please provide your website contact where people can go to find the documentaries, the various episodes, and support you in your work.
True Legends, theseries.com. And also, I wanted to say that we're doing what we're calling a VIP expedition and conference, True Legends VIP expedition and conference to Cusco, Peru, in the month of June. So we're going to be going to Cusco, myself, Steve Quayle, and we're bringing in Anselm P. Rambla. If you've seen The Unholy Sea, you know who Anselm P. Rambla is. He's a internationally renowned researcher, explorer, investigator, and he's featured in our film, The Unholy Sea. He made some astounding discoveries in the Cusco region of Peru, specifically in Cusco, in the city of Cusco, in the Coricancha. And he proved that the underground system of tunnels, the underground world called the Shinkana by the natives in their Quechuan language in Peru, exists. He proved it scientifically, so he's going to be accompanying us. And we're going to be taking 20 guests on this trip. We are 2/3 full at this point. We have some room left if anybody's interested in going. It is a 5-star trip. So that means 5-star accommodations, five-star dining, and so forth. It's going to be a week long in the month of June. All the information for that trip is on our website, TrueLegendsTheSeries.com. You'll see it right on the front page. Also, if you want to get our films, it's all right there on TrueLegendsTheSeries.com. So anybody who wants to go, I encourage them to register as soon as possible. We have some spaces open, but like I said, we're about 2/3 full. So that's something exciting that we're doing in the spring that we still have room for guests to accompany us.
Awesome. Fantastic. If you would, please pick up with the story of the giants that are with us even in this day and age.
Right. So I was talking about the Bagram Air Force, the Bagram military base in Afghanistan, and the pilot that flew in to pick up some high-value cargo. Well, I said he was met at the airport on the runway by what he refers to as the babysitters, because they were assigned to accompany the cargo to its final destination. They were high-ranking military officers, possibly involved in intelligence. I don't know, but the cargo was, long story short, the cargo was the body of a giant. It was a 10 to 12 foot giant. He wasn't exactly sure if it was 10 or 12. It was somewhere in that range, but he knows exactly how much it weighed. It weighed over 1,000 pounds because they had to weigh the cargo before they put it on the AC-130. Actually, it weighed 1,100 pounds. So if you subtract the extemporaneous weight, the cables and the tarp and so forth, the guy was 1,000 pounds and very solid. He's very muscular, very solid. He was pale in color, and he had very, very large hands and feet. Obviously, they were the pilot and some of the other military personnel that were around the body of the giant when he landed to pick it up were putting their boots up against the foot of the giant and comparing their feet with his, and this was a very, very large person. And he described it as being, in his words, it was a creature that seemed to have a supernatural origin, because it was so thick and muscular and strange, bizarre, that it seemed to him that it was more than just, it had more than just physical prowess. It had some kind of supernatural connection. And this guy had no idea about anything to do with Genesis 6 or giants or Steve Quayle or anything like that. I mean, he had never heard of anything like this. And so he referred to it as a big guy. That's what they called it, a big guy. And 1,000 pound, even if it's a 10-foot tall giant, 1,000 pounds, that's a big guy. So they picked the body up, and it was covered in a tarp, partially covered in a tarp. Its head was kind of sticking out. Its hands were sticking out. Its feet were wrapped in a canvas-like fabric. And the giant was loaded onto the AC-130, and they flew it to Qatar. That's where they had to fly. They flew to Qatar and unloaded it in Qatar. And he doesn't know for certain, but he heard that it was taken to the United States from Qatar to I just lost it. The Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. I can't remember the name of it. Oh, Wright-Patterson, to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So he was told by some of the Marines at the Bagram Air Force Base when he picked up the cargo, when he picked up the body of the giant. He was told that the word is that the giant was killed in a cave in Afghanistan, somewhere in the region, certainly in Afghanistan, but somewhere in the Bagram region, that of course, they were looking for the Taliban at the time, and the Taliban were often held up in caves. And there was a particular cave near a village, and the villagers were bringing food to the mouth of the cave and other items. And so the Marines thought that they were aiding and abetting the Taliban, who were held up in the cave. So they went in to try and find the Taliban in the cave, killed the Taliban in the cave, and instead they encountered They encountered this 10 to 12 foot tall, 1,000-pound giant. They told our pilot that they had heard, this is all hearsay, the giant came, the testimony of the pilot is firsthand in terms of the dead body of the giant that he transported. But the circumstances of the giant's death was all hearsay. So they told him that the giant was killed the first team, that the first military squadron that engaged with it, and then another team was sent in having full knowledge of the situation that were able to take the giant down, and then they had a helicopter pick it up and drop it off at Bagram. So this individual, by the way, I know him. I met him here in our studio. He showed me his credentials. He is an active duty pilot, and he is his story has been corroborated by other sources. So the issue of live giants is a good question, because the obvious question associated with live giants is if giants exist, why don't we encounter them? Well, it's kind of like the Bigfoot. If the Bigfoot exists, why don't we encounter it? The answer is that people do encounter giants, just not, it's not an everyday occurrence, and it doesn't happen in places like Cleveland, Ohio, or Detroit or New York City. It happens in remote places like Bagram, Afghanistan. It happens in the jungles of the Amazon or in the Himalayan mountains, because remember, there was a mandate by God to Joshua and to Moses to destroy, to annihilate this hybrid race. I think that mandate still stands, actually. And I think that throughout history, the human race has been encountering and destroying these hybrids. I think that they're under the impulse of a divine mandate, for one, and also because the giants are not nice guys. These are cannibalistic, man-eating savages in many cases. The post-flood giants, the pre-flood giants, all indications are that they were very advanced, kind of a different breed. But post-flood giants, many post-flood giants, especially the contemporary accounts of post-flood giants, depict them as very savage creatures that are very strong and living in very savage conditions, such as the giant in the Bagram, in the cave in Bagram, Afghanistan, near Bagram, Afghanistan. So we're dealing with a situation that is very akin to the Bigfoot phenomenon. And you've got to go to the remote places. By the way, contemporary sightings of giants are often associated with ancient underground passageways and caverns and underground cities and so forth. The subterranean world in general. I also find it interesting that we have these very savage, man-eating, flesh-eating giants that have been probably cut off from civilization, cut off from other giants, maybe, living in very primitive conditions, and therefore they're very primitive, savage creatures. But then we also have stories. If we go into into some of the stories that come to us from ufology, we also have instances in which we're encountering giants ostensibly in abduction scenarios and piloting UFOs and associated with UFO craft. So they don't necessarily have to be savage. There may be a race that is still advanced, still using technology associated with maybe some of these other entities we mentioned before, the draconian serpentine entities. So in a contemporary sense, some of these claims from ufology, some of these abduction claims and so forth, where people have seen giants in underground bases, for example, may in fact be true, or at least there may be truth to them. So I don't have any doubt that there are giants still on the earth. And it seems to me that the post-flood race of giants. It varies. There's different kinds, a variety of different kinds of giants. Again, we've got even the Cyclops, the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants, all the way to giants that are only 8 feet tall and 9 feet tall. But then also we got 15-foot tall giants that have been reported and that whose bones have certainly been exhumed. So, and in recent times, we're talking, for example, in the island of Sardinia, bones of giants having been exhumed, mummified bodies of giants wearing clothes. So we're dealing with post-flood giants exhumed in the last 20 years, in the last 15 years. So I couldn't tell you where these entities are. I can tell you that, as I said before, the remote places of the earth is most likely where the remnants of this race exist, because of the inherent conflict that they would have with modern man in any scenario. I mean, and again, we have to remember that there was a divine mandate from God given to Joshua to annihilate that race. So hopefully that answers your question to some degree.
Yeah, it does, and we appreciate again your elaboration on that particular story, because it is fascinating, and it for those that doubt the validity of the Bible and its confirmation of the presence of these beings all throughout the annals of history, the fact that they are still being encountered in the world is most certainly verification and as to the veracity again of the scriptures as the word of God, and as also as being truthful. And so I think that's a very important story that people should know about. But I wanted to ask you also about the mythologies, because that's one of the very unique aspects of the work that Steve Quayle has done in writing the books that he has written about the giants and the fallen angels, and that's the mythologies and his relationships with the different Native American indigenous peoples worldwide, in bringing their stories to print, and also in paralleling all of the various accounts worldwide of the stories in connection with these particular entities. And so can you tell us about stories that you have heard as far as the mythological connections to the antediluvian sites, these Cyclopean constructs, and just the various mythological accounts, some examples, if you would, that you could share with us of what you've encountered in
Well, there are
your
many
travels and have heard.
There are many stories and legends of giants, both in more of a contemporary setting, recent history, and going back to the ancients. Steve did a great job in his book, Genesis 6 Giants, which is basically an encyclopedia of giants and legends of giants. Also, the book True Legends, which our documentary series True Legends is based on Steve's book, True Legends. In fact, our series is based primarily on 2 books. It's based on Steve Quayle's True Legends book and on David Flynn's work, the Cydonia, Secret Chronicles of Mars. And but specifically dealing with stories that I've personally encountered while in the field in these various locations. I spent a lot of time in Peru. I'm very familiar with some of the giant mythology in Peru, and what the Incas believed about the giants and the legends that they told concerning the giants. The Inca believed that giants once existed in the earth and that they were destroyed in a great flood, and that there was a race of lesser giants that were lesser in stature and in capacity, capability than the giants which were exterminated in the great flood. So the Incas view, and not only the Inca, but the other tribes too living in the region under the dominance of the Incan Empire, also shared the same views about the giants. In fact, what I find very interesting is that in Peru, most people who are familiar with the giant, the mythos of the giants in the United States, are familiar with the mounds and the mound builders, and the fact that in the 19th century there were many reports in the newspapers and so forth of people who were discovering bones of giants between 9 and 15 feet tall. I should say between 7 and 15 feet tall in these mounds, associated with these mounds, and these bones were subsequently confiscated by agents of the Smithsonian, the Great Smithsonian Cover-Up, as it is called in the United States. Well, in Peru, the natives used to worship the mounds because they believed that the bones of giants, I should say they knew that the bones of giants in many cases were buried within the mounds. And so the primitive mind of these natives, in the primitive minds of these natives, the giants were turned into mounds. That's why their bones were inside of them. But we know that, in fact, because of what we've discovered here in the United States, that the giants, at least a particular race of giants, had this custom of building these artificial mounds and turning and burying their family members or chieftains or whoever they were inside of these mounds. And so the Native Americans were encountering the very same thing in South America, which indicates that at least, as I said, there was at least one kind of race of giants that was practicing this burial technique, and so it wasn't unique to the United States. It was probably ubiquitous in the Americas. In fact, I find some of this evidence also in Sardinia, but that's so that's evidence that it might have occurred in Europe also. So there's all kinds of. Whenever you find megaliths, you always find stories, legends of giants, always associated with megaliths for two reasons. Number one, because the megaliths were discovered by the civilizations such as the Inca. They were not built by the Inca. They were not built, many of the megaliths, by the Aztec or the Maya. They were discovered. They were occupied by these later civilizations, the civilizations that discovered them. And they were built upon the ruins of many of these megalithic structures. The civilizations that discovered them would actually build their temples and so forth right on top of the megalithic foundation. So, but they attributed the building to giants in many cases. And again, in the simple minds of native peoples, they couldn't imagine how anything but giants could have built, for example, the walls at Ollantaytambo or the edifices at Pumapunku. So did giants build all the megaliths? I tend to believe that that's too simplistic of an answer. I believe that in many cases, yes. And in fact, this brings me to an interesting point, which I know we're running out of time, but there's an interesting anecdote that I came across, and frankly, in David Flynn's work concerning Cain and giants. And it appears that there was a legend in Lebanon concerning the construction of Baalbek, which is definitely one of the most mind-blowing megalithic sites in the world. Some of the largest, if not the largest, megalithic stones are to be found in Baalbek. And the legends, and this was discovered by a French historian who worked in the area for some time and talked to the locals and tried to figure out what the traditional history was, the history according to the local populace concerning Baalbek. And what he found out was that legend says that it was Cain who built Baalbek, but he didn't build it alone. He employed giants to build it. And I find that interesting because they go on to tell him that was obviously in the pre-flood context, but then in the post-flood context, when Baalbek was destroyed in the flood, Nimrod rebuilt it with the help of post-flood giants. So
Interesting.
that's a very interesting story that ties those two dynamics together. So here you have Cain, on one hand, employing giants to build the original foundations of Baalbek, and then you have Nimrod resurrecting the ruins of Baalbek with the help of post-flood giants. So certainly, I believe giants were involved in the building of the temples, of the megalithic sites. Now, and this sort of unlocks a mystery. This unlocks some confusion, I think, that I certainly have had, and that many people have had who've gone to these megalithic sites or who watch documentaries such as our films that feature these sites. And that is this. The mystery is this, that sometimes you encounter these megalithic sites, sometimes, that appear to have been built by giants, but when you get inside of them, you can't imagine giants actually moving around or passing through the doorways. And you wonder, why would giants build these megalithic edifices, but then make the doors so small, so that if they were 8 feet tall, they would have to squat down and bend down to pass beneath them? I mean, you and I wouldn't build a house with a doorway that wasn't large enough for us to comfortably pass through it. And that always bothered me. But the answer, I think, is here. I think the answer is in this anecdote from this French historian, whose name I would butcher. I think it's Alouf is his name. And the fact is that I believe that in many cases it was regular-sized people who employed giants to help them build some of these structures. So in some cases, I believe the giants themselves built the structures, and in other cases, perhaps many cases, it was individuals like Cain or Nimrod or others who came afterwards who employed the races of giants, who were renowned, especially the Cyclops, for their ability, for their craftsmanship and their ability in stonemasonry to construct these edifices for them. So you have this duality, you have this situation happening on the earth where giants are building edifices for themselves in some cases, which directly reflect their own proportions, and giants are building these megalithic Cyclopean edifices for others, for normal-sized people. And I think that that could possibly clear up a lot of confusion in some people's minds.
Well, it's an absolutely fascinating subject, and we most certainly appreciate your insight into all of these subjects. And you've been helped a lot of people come to the truth on a lot of these issues. When do you foresee the third? You say it's in post-production now?
It will be it's slated for episode 3, which doesn't have a name yet. It's untitled at this time. Is slated for release in the spring. We're actually working under a tight deadline right now. So unless we run into some major problems, it will be released in the spring, probably in April. And again, Tom Horn is involved in our series now on the ground level. We have some very exciting content dealing with Tom Horn and Steve Quayle, myself, in the desert Southwest, but then also the finds that we made in Sardinia.
Thank you again, Brother Timothy. We will pray for your protection and that of your crew and all of the endeavors and all of your work